This is the first episode of the Scratch That podcast. This episode was shot about a year ago with Dylan Gous, but unfortunately I had some troubles with the audio and other aspects, and now this episode is only being released a year after its intended date. Dylan was, however, extremely gracious to sit down with me, a complete stranger, and have a conversation that lasted more than 2 hours. In our time together, we touch on religion, the New Age, rationality, G.K Chesterton, and a bunch of other topics. It is evident, however, that this is my first episode, so please excuse the filler words, all the ums and the yes. I am resolute on improving my articulation and interlocution ability, so please bear with me. Thanks again, Dylan.
Thanks for having me. It's so nice to be here.
Yeah, man, this is a conversation I've been looking forward to for quite some time. There are some things about you, your journey specifically, and the fact that you kind of went on that journey coming from an Afrikaans milieu, you know, with someone with the surname Gous, ending up where you've ended up. I don't want to give away too much because I think we'll kind of get to these points through our conversation. But yeah, there's a lot of interesting things there and things that I resonate a lot with. And one of the takeaways from our last conversation was this idea that doubting the uniqueness of one's story, you know, like I thought I had a really unique story, the type of journey I've been on, you know, as an Afrikaans person going this alternative route and meeting someone like you, it's like, okay, I guess there are a few stories that we all seem to participate in. But anyways, we'll get to that. I think the question that I'll kick it off with is, when was the moment you realized you weren't a Christian? Was there a moment like that?
When did I realize I was not a Christian anymore? That's a really good question. And I actually do have a moment. I was walking in the garden at home. This is many years ago. I was, I think, working already. And I was walking in the garden and I kind of heard myself say to myself that, you know, what if there is no God? And then I kind of went to, okay, there is no God. And then I said it for the first time actually said it out loud to myself. And I said, okay, there is no God. What does that mean? And then after that, it's like, it was a very strange feeling because I realized that I sort of became aware of a perception that there was always something there, observing and listening and caring as well, and assisting, but also challenging me. And suddenly it's like I didn't know what to do with that perception. I didn't know what to do with that thing that was there now, because it couldn't be God. It had to just be a kind of consequence of our mental tool set or something. And so gradually I sort of go on with life and have to sort of contend with explaining to myself what it means, to me at least, not in a grand philosophical sense, but just what it means to me that I no longer believe in God. So yeah, that was actually the moment. A lot of things led up to that, but that was like the moment.
Sure. How old were you when you had that experience?
So when I was studying at college, I was still a Christian. I still remember standing in the parking lot and talking apologetics with people. I was talking about the moral law and how if there's a moral law that necessitates a moral lawgiver and all that. So I was still at college, and I still remember people telling me, "Oh yeah, I don't believe in this," but I was kind of nominally Christian, I would say. I was sincere in my belief, but I don't know. It was probably more routine if I look back at it now. And then after that, in college, I got introduced to Alan Watts, and the one day we had a lesson, and actually our guitar lecturer, he just decided to play us some Alan Watts. I can't remember the context, and it was very captivating to me. It was very captivating to me, and it kind of challenged my conception of God. And at the same time, I was playing in a band at church. I was the guitarist for the church band, so every week I was at the church. This was a Protestant, sort of non-denominational, but Afrikaans and English church. And then I'm coming to your question. And then all of that was happening. So I'm guessing around probably like early 20s, if not 19, 20. So out of high school, studying would have been like 19, 20, 21. It starts happening there. And then I start listening to the atheist side of the argument, and I start having issues with, how do I reconcile this, and why do I believe this? Is this not just something that I'm kind of justifying? I don't really see the positive impact this is having on my life anymore. I don't really have reasons to believe anymore. And then sort of, it's funny to say it, but atheism kind of fills that gap, even though atheism is it's a non-thing. It's not a positive position. It's a lack of belief, right? I would say.
That's very interesting. So was there a point in your life where you considered yourself an atheist? Like, would you label yourself with that term?
Yeah, I was quite proud of the fact that I was an atheist. I thought most of humanity were fools and idiots. I thought I would drive on the road and I would see a billboard about Christ or about the church, and I would just roll my eyes, and I would make sure that other people knew I was rolling my eyes and how ridiculous I thought it was. And I was kind of like, I think it's in that book by Flaubert, that book Madame Bovary, where he talks about how this woman like kneels down to something beautiful, and even though even though God might not be real, there's still value in belief. I kind of even struggled with that. I think I was kind of almost anti-theist, where I thought elements of religion actively poison people. But I mean, if I look back now, it wasn't really my own thoughts. I was just a mishmash of different personalities online that I thought sounded clever and sounded cool, and I wanted to kind of be part of that sort of edgy, outside the norm aesthetic. And not believing in God was like the easiest way to do that, because I just had to literally change some prepositions about how I viewed reality, as opposed to having to actually do something, if that makes sense.
No, it makes total sense. I resonate with that a lot. I remember a point where, like, after I also considered myself for the first time not a Christian, I remember going to Facebook to go change my religious status as agnostic, and I felt it was such a like thing I was doing, making this like proclamation of like anti-faith or whatever you would call it, So yeah, I definitely get that. I'm curious about the Alan Watts side of it, and I'm curious to know to what extent you dipped into the alternative world. I call it alternative, but that whole alternative Eastern side, I never got to like dabbling with atheism per se. Like the furthest I could go was calling myself an agnostic. And even then it was like agnostic theist. There was like something that was like, oof, dare I call myself an atheist? And then like the whole Alan Watts was kind of like the door to a whole paradigm, which included, a whole bunch of Eastern stuff, but also like a whole other array of like eclectic and eccentric personalities like Terence McKenna and that whole thing. To what extent did you delve into that world I just described?
Very deep. I, at one point, was trying to arrange myself and a big group of people to go to the I can't remember their name anymore. It's been so long, but to go to the caves that McKenna visited when he came to South Africa, to go to those caves and to sit with a big group and actually, you know, do as you do. So that was, that was maybe like just to give you a kind of inkling. And, you know, my friend and I would go to Psytrance festivals, and I won't repeat the same like things I've said in previous recordings because I've said it so many times now. But basically, you know, we would have crowds of people kind of sitting with us, and we would be talking about we'd be breaking down McKenna and Watts so that we could kind of have conversations with people that weren't really philosophically inclined, but then they didn't have a framework to understand these experiences they were having. So we kind of came in and we were trying to do that for people, and we were trying to find people that had a more philosophical bent. And so we were actively trying to create positive communities within that whole world. But to answer your question, I was very deep. I mean, I've read so much Watts and listened to so many hours. The same with McKenna, Robert Anton Wilson, Manly P. Hall. Dennis McKenna too, Terence's brother. So I was very deep into that whole world, really, to answer your question.
Did you ever get to a point where you realized a necessity for a structure in the form of religion, but still prior to the realization of Christianity? So was there a point where perhaps through Alan Watts and the McKenna thing, in the beginning it's kind of a mishmash and there's no structure, but was there a point perhaps through them or individuals in that space where you started thinking perhaps I should become a Zen Buddhist or a Hindu or something like that? Yeah.
So I think there's kind of two questions there that I could maybe explore. One is just the need for structure, and then the other one is I know that it's a similar question, but I want to draw a distinction because I remember being at a festival, and you get out of the car and it's people are already looking for something to smoke or something to take. And we got out of that car, and I just realized that the parking was a total mess. And I thought, yes, okay, guys, let's be organized here. If we're going to do this, we should at least have some structure. And it hit me that actually structure and order are just part of existence. I mean, it's just part of life. You organize thoughts in sentences, which are really just structures. Grammar is really just almost like a series of structural rules that affect the way you perceive things. So it's really impossible to go through life without at some point. I mean, even at the festival, if I want a pizza, I can't just go and take one. There's a whole structure and system built around having cash and going to the person and paying them and waiting for change and saying thank you and looking for a dustbin to throw away the box. And it's all those little things that we don't even think about are screaming at our face that we cannot, even are we going to plan the anarchist meeting next week? Am I going to place it upon my fellow anarchists to put it in their calendar that they come at the right time, and we follow some higher authority that structures us so we can all meet together? I'm being facetious, obviously. I'm not trying to, people come to those views for various reasons, but for me it was pretty obvious that structure as structure is obviously not a problem, but it's just an inevitability. It's a necessity of interacting with people. Then the other point with the whole New Age and that whole world, I think I realized that another form of the structure was in talking to other New Age people and realizing that really very, very few people actually hold any beliefs that are coherent from one person to the next. So you talk to one guy and Go for it. Go for it.
So I guess that's like the main uniting characteristic of the New Age is that, or at least for me, it's that there isn't a thing. It's like I quite kind of get together because we don't have this like precise through line.
Yeah.
We're kind of dancing around in some things, and one thing perhaps clicks in with another that somehow clicks in with another thing, but it's very eclectic in its makeup.
Yeah, and a good friend of mine is actually a reformed Afrikaans minister, and he and I went to go watch Dune the other night, Dune 2, which was amazing. And as we were driving back, we were talking about the New Age, and if to my knowledge, he had actually written a very detailed breakdown of what the New Age is. So I asked him the obvious question. I was like, what is the New Age, in your opinion? And he gave me a one-word answer. He was like, he said, jelly. It's like jelly. It's sticky and it's all encompassing and it's got elements of everything and things that don't fall into the brackets of obvious dogmas of other religions inevitably sort of gravitate towards New Age. And a lot of what people think is New Age, right? Like they'll incorporate elements of Hinduism or Buddhism, but even those schools of thought would go against some of the other things that they think and that they believe.
Exactly. And what you just mentioned is something, I realized that for a period I was quite involved with the Hare Krishnas, and I have a few good friends who are Hare Krishna monks, and I lived with them in a little makeshift ashram scenario. And when I entered that space, I was in a very New Age, kind of getting more into like Eastern stuff explicitly. Like I was like intentionally reading stuff that was like about Advaita Vedanta. I got exposed to the whole non-dual thing, and I was like, oh, this is what I believe and what I want to like dive into. So I started like seeing that, but it was interesting, these Hare Krishnas, and yeah, they're wonderful. I have a soft spot in my heart for them.
Yeah.
They have this society at the university, right? And it's quite a nice space that they cultivate on certain evenings where there's like this kirtan, mantra meditation, and there's great food. Of course, the food forms part of their like spiritual, they have like this metaphysical view of that as well. But they kind of cultivate this space, and then the types of characters it draws is a very like New Age orientated, if you want to say orientated, type person, So these evenings hosted by the Hare Krishnas would usually draw all these types of persons, and they wouldn't necessarily know that it's being hosted by Hare Krishnas. They're just thinking they're chanting mantras and dancing and smelling the good incense. But it's quite funny because like these exact Hare Krishnas that I was affiliated with and friends with, they were very much opposed to this whole New Age mishmash spirituality, and although they were cultivating this space, it was kind of for them to kind of bring these New Age people into a more structured thing. But that's the whole point, like these people are participating in these mantra meditations and they're like, oh, namaste and enlightened or whatever. And meanwhile, like the thing they're participating in, where that comes from, is this kind of a way more structured and serious view, something that perhaps in comparison to what they think about Christianity is much more serious. So yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all go through that in stages in a way. So I think that the reason those people are going there is because some part of them does want something solid and something structural and a people who think the same way. And, you might say, well, why not just believe these things yourself and privately? Well, it's almost like just kind of reading the Bible on your own and coming to your own conclusions, as you end up believing things that just completely alienate you from everybody else, and you're not necessarily closer to the truth. So I think there's like an instinctual understanding that we all have that, I could probably stay home, and speaking now as one of these New Age guys, I could probably stay home and hit a big dab and then take DMT, and then I'd probably be enlightened. But you know what? Actually, going down to the local place and seeing a few guys and just saying a few hymns and smelling some incense, that actually sounds better, which is strange. So then as time goes on, maybe someone realizes they want Christ, and then it's the same thing. It's like, okay, I could just sit and read the scriptures, and I could literally just sit at home and talk to God. I have direct access. But you know what? Actually, I think I'm going to go down to the place and speak to other Christians and talk about, and what are their experiences, and maybe I can learn something, and maybe they can help me with something. So there's absolutely this communal element. So I don't think that's a bad thing. I mean, guys are coming because there's something in that Hare Krishna event, that there's something there for them. And, I don't think that's surprising.
Yeah, without a doubt, like through my experience with it, I've really had an opportunity to contemplate the way God's grace works, and this kind of clicks in with with psychedelics to a certain extent, which we might touch on. But this idea of like God's grace isn't confined to a certain space, And if I think about my own personal journey, coming from this like very impersonal conception of the transcendent, if I would call it that, because that was like the impersonal view of it, the transcendent, not nothing personal. It was through the Hare Krishnas that I opened up to the possibility of the ultimate truth being a person, that forms part of like Hare Krishna dogma. And they're quite like, they go out of their way to emphasize that, that's something that they're quite proud of, is like their bhakti tradition, and saying like at the ultimate end, truth is a person, Of course, in the Hare Krishnas, it's Krishna, wow. But there's something there, and for me, it was a stepping stone. It was a stepping stone, like, oh yeah, and like opening myself to it, you get to, once you start experiencing truth as a person, that's a whole different thing. That's very different, That opens up a whole new can of worms, So, for example, I think that's one of the things that might be happening at these spaces like the Hare Krishnas. You get the people going there. I don't know if 1% of them are becoming Hare Krishnas, but it's not uncommon for many of them to end up being Christians or going some other journey, but it's a stepping stone in some direction, So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right on God's grace not being limited. I mean, to say God's grace is limited is to say that God is limited. So, you're not going to go down that road. So, I mean, obviously, God speaks to people where they are at the time they need it, in the way they need it. So, I don't know how that looks for some people. I don't know how that plays out in their lives. And from the outside looking in, no one knows. Only that person. I mean, there's a very real sense in which we think we know, oh, well, if, this guy believes X because of Y. If I just change Y, he will believe X. But it's not like that at all, I don't think. I think people are way more complicated, and there's a real internal dialogue people are having with God, even when they don't know they're having an internal dialogue with God, I think. This is why it's so important to just look at where you are and what you can do for the people around you, instead of going on the Reddit and having 6-hour arguments with people about 3 words in the creed, which is obviously an important point, but like there's limits here, and there's things that we need to worry about that are, I think much more pressing.
That point you touched on now is something that's very dear to me, as like a pretty fresh Orthodox convert. I like often feel like, geez, guys, aren't we missing the point? The like whole online, either trad Catholic or ortho bro space is like, oh my word. It's very strange, you know. Like when I'm exposed to that space, the Reddit or all these like apologists on YouTube, there's some great people, but there are also like people kind of just throwing wood on the fire. It all just comes back to like the personal and the local, you know, like getting people to go to a church, getting people to be in a sacred space, and like it's the whole thing happens here, you know. It doesn't happen in a subreddit. Like it happens here, and that's where I want to get to. Essentially, is like, okay, so that's probably one thing that's very attractive in these alternate spiritualities, you know, this emphasis on experience, and to some extent the spiritual becomes tangible, and of course psychedelics play a role in this, you know. All of a sudden you've got this thing that kind of just it gives you the sense overload, and it is this very, very tangible experience, and you connect it with something spiritual, and you try and plug it into this like alternative framework of reality, and there's like a lot of meaning involved with that, and it's super attractive coming from Calvinism or something like that, you know. It's very attractive in comparison. Oh my word. So but the thing that fascinates me even more isn't that how someone ends up going that route. That makes total sense to me, you know. That like the kicker for me is like how someone goes from being enveloped in that space, which is super rich. It's like, and there is like meaning to be derived there, and a sense of peace. I don't know your story exactly or your inner experience regarding that space, but I know when I was involved with those things and chanting mantras, I had some very tangible experiences of peace and all the things associated with like good spirituality, you know. So being in a place like that, and then somehow being drawn to another space which isn't that, and which a space that perhaps requires that one even closes the book and or the chapter that has all these like little bells and lights and all the flashy and the yummy and delicious stuff, but like getting to a place where very, very literally it is picking up your cross and embracing a worldview where you're prepared to suffer because you feel that's more in line with reality and truth. That's it's like such an absurd, it's such an absurd thing for me to even grasp how that happens. Of course, I've experienced that in my own life, but I'd like to know what happened in your life, Dylan, that made you like turn towards this other path, which I guess we're getting to now. And we'll elaborate on.
Well, to just touch on what you said at the end there, I don't think it's actually, I can only speak from my own experience, but I never perceived it as I'm going to choose to live a life of suffering and difficulty. It's more like, okay, life is suffering and difficulty. I mean, that's Buddha's first bullet point, right? Dukkha. So it's like, okay, given that this is the case, am I suffering well? Am I actually, and I kind of felt like in my mind, when I was confronted with real suffering, where someone very close to me was like crying, also funny enough, in a garden, walking in the garden, and person starts crying, and I just realized like I have no philosophy that can provide comfort in this situation. Now looking back, if I were a Christian at the time, I could have said, well, you know, Christ has been through worse than this. Any suffering we endure, Christ has been through worse. So we can unite, we can find comfort in that reality. And you know what, eventually every tear will be dried. And but I didn't have any of that. I mean, I didn't believe any of that. So for me, it was like the whole, because I was very Wattsian. It wasn't even true Buddhism or true Hinduism. It was a kind of westernized, I'm going to use the word bastardized version of these things that has been sort of shipped and packaged for export to Westerners. And that worldview that actually I am God and you are God, and this is really just a game we're playing on ourselves. I could not look at this person I loved and sincerely believe that. It just to me in that moment sounded like two capital letters of BS. I just had no way to reconcile the abject suffering with my philosophy. So for me, that was a big moment where I realized, like, it's not so much that I'm choosing something to suffer. It's more that, okay, I can't get rid of suffering, but the way I'm viewing it now is just wrong. I just feel it intuitively in my soul. And as a consequence, I tried to fit suffering into experience. I tried to make sense of it in a better way. And Christianity, I mean, that's not ultimately not like a point why someone would convert. Oh, Christ suffered, therefore Christianity is true. But within the larger framework, I just wanted to touch on that suffering point, because I don't think it's like we go, hey, I want to suffer more, let me become a Christian. I think it integrates suffering in the way it's supposed to. So you can suffer well and actually offer up your suffering for the repose of somebody else's soul. You can take your suffering, and it's almost like a currency. And you can, as a Catholic, I shouldn't talk about currency and souls, but it's basically like you can use your suffering to pay, metaphorically speaking, for somebody else's wrongs. And I just think that's a beautiful, because that is what we do. I mean, when you work and you labor and you make money and you put it in the bank, you are suffering for future people's benefit, your family and so it just makes perfect sense to me through the Christian sphere. I hope that sort of answered your question.
It answers it perfectly. Like, I guess that is one of the fundamental shifts, is this, it's the lens that changes. You're completely right. Suffering is, and I guess a lot of these other views, it's like kind of trying to get rid of it. It's like, oh, I want to get rid of suffering, or like the state of suffering. Perhaps people equated with like a lower stage. You see it. I see it a lot in how people interpret this whole the power of now type stuff. It's like, oh, you just got to be more present. Whatever suffering there is, it's just you're clinging, and it's kind of like people kind of present themselves and like, oh, suffering is not even part of my reality because I've transcended suffering. It's just be here now, man. But like the Christian thing is like, well, yeah, it kicks off from the Buddha's thing with dukkha. It's like suffering is, what do we do with this? And that whole thing is like kind of a transmuting it in some way, changing it, flipping it on its head. I feel that's like a big Christian theme. It's like, yeah, please go.
Yeah, but I want to just touch on there that I think actually Buddha was right, but I don't think he was right enough. I don't think life is only suffering. I think life is also opportunity to add real joy and real love to an otherwise fallen world. So because we have free will, because we aren't all one identical thing, because we are actually separate in our will, and we actually can make decisions that have real consequence, that means that you actually can make the world better than it currently is. You can choose to do the thing that you should do that actually might not even make sense to people around you, but in the bigger scheme of things is actually adding real love and real joy. Because I mean, yeah, suffering makes all of the horrible things possible, but the fact that we can choose how we view suffering means that life isn't limited to suffering only. So it's like, okay, yes, life is suffering now. I can actually improve things, and one day that suffering will be wiped away, and that none of that is part of the basic Buddhist view. I know that you could say, well, in the cycle, in the cycle, eventually suffering will be wiped away, but I don't know, that's still very individual. It's still talking about the person's individual cycle. It's not all encompassing, right? It's not like the Christian view where all of reality is going to be redeemed, but I digress.
I think it's spot on. And I think a big part of it comes down to like a fundamental view of reality. Do you see reality as Maya? Is it purely illusion? Is it purely like yeah, is it illusion? And then in that case, suffering is illusion as well in that view, and the opposite of it as well, like joy, or whichever way one would view the opposite of that. That's also just part of the illusion. And I think one thing which is super interesting about the Christian worldview is like the reality of things, the reality of matter. That it's like this is it. This is it. You know, like it's not even, and matter doesn't like negate like the spiritual. It's like it kind of brings these two together, and that's, I guess, what the incarnation is. It's like this is it. This is, as it's like it's spiritual and it's matter, and it's like this wonderful thing together, and it's real. I guess that's the point. It's real. So when there's suffering, it's real. It's not like the Wattsian, it's some actor mask. It's just someone crying, and that's a really weird place to be in, you know. And I know that place. I remember like laughing, and this is like super psychotic to even mention, and I'm like kind of shocked at myself to mention it, but I remember laughing, seeing a beggar, thinking like, oh, look at this guy, he's incarnation, silly little soul doing what he's doing. What did he do to take on this incarnation? You know, he's playing a game. We're all playing the game, and Christianity makes it all just real. You know, it's like, oof, it makes it more real, and like the moral implications of that is something I'm still kind of getting, still adjusting to.
Yeah, it's. I mean, to be fair, I think that beggar on the street, you probably would have also thought, well, this is not forever, right? At some point, he will actually ascend, and he will still have a good experience. So it's not like you were, you know, complete. I mean, within that framework, now it sounds silly, but within that framework, it's like, okay, he has to go through that now, and it's just convenient that you don't happen to be him right now. Right? Yeah, so there's like this, there's something underneath it that just doesn't sit well. Yeah, exactly. And it's like, oh, but he's actually more enlightened than me because he doesn't know it. You know, he's fully in the game, and I'm actually the one who's suffering because I'm aware of this. And oh, woe is me. Let me go home to my, you know, my beautiful home and my. I wish I could be him. It's so, I don't even know a word for it. But there's so many problems with it that when you really sit down with it, it just feels like some kind of covert narcissism. But yeah,
it reminds me, and again, I feel I'm like perhaps sharing too much, but during this like period where I was at Stellenbosch and involved with this society, I made a friend who's pretty far out. He might be seeing us. He knows who he is if he sees it, and when I met him, we resonated a lot, you know, over the whole Ramdas thing, Neem Karoli Baba, the idea of what a guru is. We were like kind of in that, you know. And at one point, he brought this homeless guy to the society meeting, and I had a previous. Anyway, yeah, I'm thinking what I should articulate, but I'm just gonna get it to the point. No need to like. Explain the whole motivation behind it. But when he brought him to the society, I told him, "Oh, who is this?" And he was like, "No, it's his guru, a very literal homeless man." And that was very interesting, you know, interesting period, and it was interesting to see how he kind of engaged with this homeless person relationally, and even to some extent me, you know, he was like very much drawing me into this like world where I was like, is this really his guru? Like Neem Karoli Baba was just a homeless wanderer man. Is it finally happening? Did I finally meet my guru, and am I finally going to get enlightened, you know? And just to show yeah. I think that's enough said about that for now.
Yeah. No, but I'm laughing because I know that mindset. Yeah, it's like you start really living in a kind of fairy tale, and I don't mean that in necessarily a bad way, because I think being a Christian is also to some degree living in a fairy tale, but you kind of have to choose the story you want to inhabit, and
Yeah.
maybe the story where the homeless guy is your guru is not the story you want to inhabit.
Yeah,
I don't
perhaps
know.
not. Perhaps not, you know. But I think, if anything, it shows the extent. Um, it shows the extent to what like your worldview can really influence you. You know, like your thoughts and yeah, you really got to pay attention to what you pay attention to, because those things really form you. You know, they form the way how you see the world. And I guess that at that point, I wasn't really thinking twice about these things. You know, it was just like following what even seemed to be breadcrumbs. If there were breadcrumbs, that's like a different thing now. But you really get the sense of like going on this path, and once you start reading the far outness of these people and of reality, and once you get to a point where you really think, oh, reality is plastic and it's illusion and anything's possible, and like perhaps the whole game can change in a moment, you open yourself up to some really strange things, you know. And I guess cults become a thing, and weird things happen. But I think my takeaway from it is that the people that get sucked into these things, they're not like strange, they're not like fringe people. I guess to some extent they are, because they do get sucked into it, you know. And but the thing is, I resonate with that, and I come from like a normal, like upper middle class Afrikaans private school. There's nothing weird in that. I haven't experienced strange traumas as a child. I'm like a very normal person, quote unquote. Yet I can like, yeah, I could see how I could very easily, if the coin just landed on a different side, or if yeah, I could easily see how one decision could lead to another thing, which leads to being in a cult, you know. So yeah, it's
Yeah,
fascinating.
yeah. To selling everything you own and flying to some remote part of a country and just living there for like the next 10 years and working on a farm. And but it's very true. I mean, the people, I mean, I think honestly, Christianity is a good example, because in many ways, the things I believe now are way stranger and way weirder than anything even close that I came close to in the New Age. Even with the most intense psychedelics, Christianity is far stranger. Far stranger. The idea that the Son of God is dead because we murdered him is literally so crazy. Nothing I've ever had on a trip has even come close to an idea that, and then to think that billions believe this, and that history is divided between that moment. I mean, this is why for me, when people say, oh, thank the universe for this, thank the universe for that, that's thinking too small. Like, if you really want to be far out, if you really want to be spiritually to the point where things almost seem insane, actually Christianity is the because it claims to be so real. It's every other religion points to gods who have unique features or have special abilities like the Greek gods, or who have many arms like some Hindu gods. But Christianity just points to a man who is not just a man, but is also, in fact, God, a part of the Trinity, which is a whole other conversation, which is just even stranger. And so for me, I don't think you go down to something neutral when you leave psychedelics. I think when you go to Christianity, you're amping up. You're amping up the bizarreness of reality. The fairy tale becomes far stranger, but it's mythical, but it's true. As Tolkien said, it's the true myth.
Yeah, I like everything you just said. And that's very much my experience of it. When I try to tell people about why I have become a Christian, and it was like a very strange and gradual process. I think a lot of people expect this rational answer, and whenever I try to rationalize it, I lose it. So now it's not even it's not pointless. It's pointless for me to even try and do it. But what you just mentioned, that initial thing, and now I wouldn't necessarily even use this word to describe it, but initially that is what I used to describe it, and describe my attraction towards Christianity was its absurdity. I was like, it's so absurd, it has to be real, which is a very strange thing to like. That's a strange sentence to say, like if you're trying to get to it rationally. But that encapsulates my feeling. I was like, this is utterly absurd. It has to be real, and I guess not. I guess this is a good opportunity to segue to Chesterton, because there are people online and the whole space has kind of opened up in this way that a lot of people are coming to Christianity exactly through this, through this re-enchanted view of reality. It's not this evangelical, propositional presentation of what Christianity is. Like, here are the premises, here's the conclusion, thus God is. There's this new window that has kind of opened, and that has been there, I guess, forever, but it feels so fresh, and I'm talking about people like Jonathan Peugeot, and of course Jordan Peterson kicked open a massive door that many have just kind of flooded through, and people take it further, in my case via Jonathan Peugeot. But there's this like view of reality and this view of Christianity where people aren't trying to sell it based on like a rational like theses, like, oh, here it is, but they're like opening up this opportunity of viewing reality in a certain way where Christianity is the only conclusion. That's like, if like there's a certain way to see the world, and if you see the world that way, like Christianity is inevitable, and that's such a like interesting way to get to it. Essentially, there's not a question in that, but if you want to take any of that and run, and the question I do have is perhaps tied to Chesterton, because I think Chesterton is one of the, when I read Orthodoxy for the first time, it was that as well. It was, he's not trying to rationalize it. In fact, like the strength in it is in the magical side of it. Please go ahead.
Well, I can give you four points to kind of add something of value, hopefully, to what you just said. Or the first point is just that Alan Watts isn't all bad, and I did learn a lot from him. And one thing and I should say, Alan Watts was actually influenced by Chesterton. So to some degree, a lot of the things I learned from Watts, I actually ended up finding in Chesterton, who lived about 50 to 70 years before Watts. But one thing Watts did say is that, and it's really good advice for a couple, and it's basically, if a woman asks you, why do you love me? You should not give her reasons, because we don't want rational reasons for love. What you should say, and this is what I do say if my wife says, why do you love me? And it's true. I say, I don't know. I can't help but love you. I'm at a total loss. You just bowl me over. I have and people really like that. People appreciate that sincerity, because, and here comes Chesterton so beautifully, and he says, all of the philosophies of the world are rationally wrong, but Christianity is irrationally right. And I love that, because it just points that it is irrational, but it's correct. And then another thing I could say is that Chesterton has a beautiful poem called The Convert. I did a video on it recently, and he lists all the world's philosophies. He like talks about the sages trace their philosophies like a giant cosmic tree, and they speak of ideas from centuries of old, and he goes through all these like philosophies, and then right at the end, and he says, "But none of this matters to me because my name is Lazarus, and I'm alive." So
Yeah. Oh, whoa.
you
Wow, that's
they are they I don't, that's Chesterton. So it's like there are reasons to believe in Christianity. There are rational reasons. There's historical evidence, there are arguments, and people are having those arguments, and let people keep having those arguments. But if you're having a one-on-one dinner with me and we're having a beer, and you say, "Why do you love Christ?" I'm going to say, "I can't help but love Christ. I don't have rational reasons, ultimately. I've fallen in love with him and who he is. And I know how weird that is. I know it's the strangest thing in the world. It perplexes me more than it perplexes anybody else. And so this is why Slavoj Zizek, the Slovenian philosopher, happiness from that guy, he says that if you have reasons to love someone, you don't love them. And it's the same idea. It's there is an irrationality at the base of it, and that doesn't make sense if you've never experienced love, if you've never experienced something by its nature irrational. Of course, everybody knows what that feeling is like because pretty much I believe everybody experiences love to varying degrees. So so just to round this up, in terms of reasons for belief, it's like there is an irrational element at the bottom, and that's not something to be ashamed of. I think that's just that is the nature of love, and God is love. And then on the other side of and again, these are not apologetic arguments, right? I'm not arguing. I'm not trying to make a deductive philosophical case here, but Chesterton pretty much re-enchants that. He reminds the reader of that beauty. So he'll say things like, when Christ was in the manger and he reached up to his mother's face, the first mother, the Theotokos would have been right there. He says, not only was he reaching up to his mother, but his hands, his baby hands, reached up to the same stars they had created. So that re-enchantment is so, it's all over the scripture, but we are so in the West so obsessed with the rationality and the debates, and how many times does this word appear in this gospel, and but this is not synoptic, and like we're missing the poetry of the whole story. And when you let the poetry overwhelm you, it's akin to seeing a beautiful woman and falling in love with her. It's like you don't need rational reasons. Everything in your being says go.
Yeah, that's the place to be. Why would you want to be anywhere else? That's the place. It's amazing hearing these this poetry you just mentioned from Chesterton. I almost feel ashamed that I haven't looked into it enough, because it's absolutely, that's it. That the way he describes it. That's the place. That's the place.
Okay. There's a reason there's a Chesterton Society. Sorry to cut you off, but there's a reason there's a Chesterton Society, right? Because this guy's incredible. I mean, there's a cause to make him a saint. So, I mean, his writing is up there. But anyway, please continue.
I'll try and keep my thoughts together, because there's a lot going on right now. One of them, you mentioned Slavoj and Alan Watts, and it's interesting because I've noticed both of them mention Chesterton, and already that's the first time I heard about Chesterton was through Alan Watts. And it's interesting for me that these figures, someone like Slavoj Žižek, he has a deep admiration of Chesterton, So yeah, I'm not even sure what that says about Chesterton, but there's a lot going on there, if you got someone like Slavoj Žižek, really admiring you. This whole idea of re-enchantment. Yeah, please go ahead, Dylan.
Oh, I was just going to say, well, we don't realize it, but Chesterton was kind of, I mean, obviously not to the same degree because technology is limited, but in terms of being like a public figure, you could almost say, he would have been like today's equivalent of a Stephen Fry or even a Jordan Peterson. I mean, he was a heavyweight intellectual in his day. And I mean, he sparred with Shaw and H.G. Wells and all of the sort of thinkers at the time. So when he converted to Catholicism, it will be like if Jordan Peterson converts to Catholicism. It was insane. It was like, what? Why? You know? So I just think due to history, we just don't realize how big this guy was, relatively speaking. But anyway, please go for it.
Yeah. No, it's fascinating that you mention it, you know, because like I look at the current state of the world and let's say the intellectual space, and a big part of it clicks into this whole, I hesitate to call it Christian revival, because revival has all these like Pentecostal images connected to it. But it seems that there is this like revival going on, or let's just say re-enchantment going on, you know? And like I mentioned, it feels fresh and it's like, finally. But then, like you mentioned Chesterton, and that's like 100 years back, even a bit more. And it feels like the same thing, you know. It's like he's seeing things in the same way, and he's like, it's the same mission. It's like the same worldview, and it's just funny for me how like in the like 21st century how this feels new, but there are constantly these like figures trying, like they've got it like written on massive boards saying like here it is, but somehow we all just like turn a blind eye towards it for some reason. And I guess it's just by grace that you're in a position where you can finally hear it, you know, because I'm certain a lot of people would read orthodoxy or like listen to a Jonathan Peugeot video, and it's just like, it just goes right through, you know. One of my Hare Krishna friends told me about Jonathan Peugeot back in 2020, and 2019 or 2020. And it was a few years later that I actually looked into it myself. And I finally like heard what was being said, you know, and that was like a big part of my like whole conversion story as well. A lot of the things I've heard at previous points, but it's only later that I kind of heard them, you know, and all of a sudden you start hearing this message being sung throughout history. It's not even like just the people telling, no, it's like, oh, there's this whole thing going on. You become aware of the tradition and the aliveness of the tradition. Anyways, just a little tangent, but
well, it makes me think of let them who have ears to hear. I think sometimes we hear something, but we don't have the ears to hear them yet. You know, we don't have the experiences yet. So like there's advice I could, like there's things I wish I would have done when I was 20 or 21, you know. I wish I had done them back then, like financial things. And now I'm like, man, I don't think if I went back in time and told my younger self to do X, Y, and Z, I don't think he would have understood it. I don't think he would have had the ears to hear it, if that makes sense.
No, totally. I feel the exact same. Yeah. Okay. Regarding this whole re-enchantment thing, I just want to hear if you have any like thoughts about the current state of Christianity and the movements that seem to be happening in this space. You know, I joined the Orthodox Church. I was baptized last year in June, but I've been going for about like almost 3 years now. In June, it'll be 3 years, you know. And
wow. Congrats on the baptism.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Who would have thought? I wouldn't have guessed it in a million years, you know, especially like seeing what I do now on a Sunday. Like we had this procession with icons this past Sunday, walking around the church, singing. And I'm like, what on earth are we doing? and our priest also had to point it out. It's like, this is really strange, you know, and we're doing it in Afrikaans as well, which is it's just peculiar. It's very strange. But the point I wanted to make is when I went to the church, I went to a Greek Orthodox church initially, and on the Sunday there was perhaps like 4 people there, and later on the church moved to a different place. But in the last 3 years, the church has just like exploded, and the majority of the influx is young men. It's young men. They're becoming Orthodox, and that seems to be like the general trend for converts to Catholicism as well. And it seems as if there's like an orientation specifically towards the traditional side of things. Now, there's like, I feel there's 2 things going on. One is like a political thing going on where there is this pushback against modernity, and people are turning towards tradition, and kind of religion's just a part of that. I only became aware of that thing a bit later. My personal conversion was one of religious conversion. It came through like having an experience of Christ and opening up to a new worldview and following that, and then later seeing, oh, this kind of fits into this whole political thing that's going on as well. So to what extent do you think, like, it feels that there are these like 2 streams happening? Do you think, to what extent is it one stream? Are there 2 streams? What do you make of what I just said?
Well, I think that a lot of these conversions might not have happened if the person wasn't aware of YouTube or watching YouTube videos on these topics. I do believe God would have worked with that person in some other way. So I'm not saying if not for YouTube, they would have never become a Catholic or never become Orthodox. I'm not saying that. But I think if you speak to a lot of these young men you're talking about, you and me included, you'll find that we can trace the initial pointing in that direction to a video we saw online, or an interview we listened to, or podcast we saw that initially built that interest. And God can use those tools. The problem is that those tools are also tied up in a country, because YouTube is an American company. It's an American product. Same with Instagram, same with pretty much everything except TikTok. And so you are not going to get necessarily the message without it being packaged within a sort of political framework. There are, of course, Christian YouTubers who are not talking politics. But a lot of the time, you'll sort of see a video where a guy is Catholic or Orthodox, and then he's talking about a political issue, and he's trying to kind of reconcile that with his beliefs. So a few years ago, there was the whole debacle about whether a Democrat can be pro-abortion if they are a Catholic, for example. And that's a good example of how there's this kind of dual packaging of the religious question, which is important, by the way. I don't want to dismiss it. But I think the problem that can happen is then you kind of, as a South African, as a foreigner who's not really direct, I know people will say we're all affected in some way at some point, but you're not really directly affected by what some county in some American state has decided. I mean, that's not going to affect your provincial rulings in your home country. So I think sometimes I'll meet guys who are like, they lump the Christian mission in with this, like, you know, Trump has to win. It's like, dude, you live in Komatipoort. What are you talking about? Like, why do you care about this? I mean, I understand the larger problem of, you know, people want there to be a different kind of political environment, and hopefully that will, through downstream effects, somehow change the political situation we live in. And I get all of that stuff, but it's weird how political so many of of us young men can allow ourselves to become with issues that I think really should just be a religious issue first. I don't really know if I'm making a valid point or if I'm even making a point at all. I think I'm just kind of observing this weird lumping of American politics into religion, and then you realize that a lot of the spiritual frustrations in the church are things you're getting directly from American media. I mean, I'm not experiencing a liturgy war as a Catholic here in South Africa. I go to church, I go to mass on Sunday, and people are loving the Novus Order. It's reverent. People are just happy that there is a church. People are just happy that we have. Dankie Here, ons het kerk. Just thank the Lord we have a place to go. Thank goodness I can be a Catholic without being stoned in the street. So then it's like I go online and there's this liturgy war. Now I go to mass and I'm looking at other Catholics. Or what kind of Catholic are you? It's like, you don't need that. Like just appreciate the environment you're in. And I'm sure in America there's parts of the States where they don't have that issue either. But when they go online, it's like there's this. I don't meet online people in the real world, and what I mean by that is, these really anti-Catholic people, when they talk to you, they're not like gonna, I'm sure there's some people, but like even the worst of people aren't gonna just start insulting you to your face, and they kind of generally just want to understand where you're coming from. So I think what maybe something that I have to look out for in myself is like not to project, and that term is so tied up in the New Age, but not to project what you think people think onto them, and then to respond to that projection instead of talking to the human being that's there with you. David Patrick Airy and I've talked about this a bunch, where like you think you're arguing with a Catholic, but really your idea of a Catholic is not how this person views Orthodox, how this person views this. Or it's exactly with Protestants. You're talking to a Protestant and you think you know what this person, and it's just so arrogant to assume that you know what other people think, because online you've seen other people express views and they're part of the same camp, and it's so dangerous to think that way. And I think it just dampens your whole spiritual growth.
Yeah, no, spot on. I guess it gets really messy if you view life through that way and you view people through that way. If we had to be representations of like the online trad Catholic and Ortho bro space, we wouldn't have been able to have this conversation actually. And it's exactly that, like the Ortho sphere is like, there's all these things of like ecumenism and all these like really and you get these like Orthodox I guess apologists that kind of try and speak for everyone, and you get to the parish with this in the back of your mind, and then it's exactly what you said. It's like, that doesn't even, for all intents and purposes, it doesn't exist. Like, are you a patriarch? Are you a bishop? Like, you probably then you don't have to worry about these things, But like on the local level, it's and when you bring things to the local level, it's like, it's wonderful, it's sacred, and the stuff happens, I can go smell the incense and take part in the Eucharist, and life's good, But for some, the point I wanted to make, I feel this like American spirit, whatever that is, the same spirit that imbues the politics. It's that spirit that has kind of that's imbued in like the online religious space as well. Like they can be talking about things that aren't even political. It's like purely just theology, but it's like filled with that spirit of America, and it's like very combative and a lot of like,
Yeah, and it is kind of just also the nature of social media. So this is the other thing we don't want to forget, right? It is, Twitter is, it doesn't matter what topic you're talking about, or X rather, whatever it's called now. YouTube, I mean, you could make a video conclusively proving that you've cured cancer and release that data to all the world's hospitals, and there would still be dislikes, and there would still be comments saying, "Oh, you're a grifter," and you're just doing this because you're going to get something out of it. So, like, there's literally nothing you can do that's not going to get some hate or some criticism, and that's just the nature of these programs. And so, that's not going to exclude religious conversations. That's going to be there as well, because the problem isn't the religious conversation. The problem is human beings. So we will find those things. And I actually think, you know what, those guys are important. You know, I do think there should be guys debating these topics, and I think those things should be happening. And sometimes people are a little bit rude to each other, but that's a price we pay for people to be passionate about things, is sometimes you overstep yourself. But like, I think let those conversations happen. And if you need to, if you want to learn a little bit, dip your toe in the water, take a few sips, learn. But you don't have to now fully envelop yourself in that community. And now all the content you consume is just Christian, atheist, or Catholic, Orthodox, or it's just all this all the time. It's like, how often do you actually just sit and like say a prayer? You know, like, are we? And this is a critique so many people have made. I'm not unique in saying this, right? Obviously, we all know this. We all know we shouldn't be giving all of our time to these arguments, but I don't know. I just think if I'm sitting at Mass on a Sunday and I'm aware of the fact that I'm in a third world country, the parish is low on funds. They do what they can to give us an honorable worshipping of God, to allow us to participate in that. If I sit there in the back row and I go, oh, well, Taylor Marshall would never settle for this. You know, it's like, am I really even connected to reality anymore? You know, this guy I follow online, you know, with 600 subs, he would be so upset by this. I can't wait to go and tell him on Discord tonight, and then we can share this church online, and we can all go and publicly mock it, and we can give it 1-star reviews. It's like, are you even really living the Christian life anymore at that point? Or you're just part of some activism group that's protesting things that you don't exactly agree with? And at what point does it become justified righteous anger? And Christ had righteous anger in the temple, but I don't trust myself to be able to manage that kind of anger in a holy way. I don't know how to handle righteous anger. Christ could, but I can't. I will just get angry and hateful. And so I think, you know, if you're struggling with that, you just kind of need to distance yourself a little bit from these online celebs, if I could put it that way.
Yeah. So that's the exact thing that makes me think about these converts coming to Christianity more from like this pragmatic choice, you know, say as a choice for saving the West, or it's a choice for that sort of thing, you know. And I feel there's a lot of people, or not an insignificant amount of people, coming to Christianity, calling themselves Christians, but it's out of this space, you know. It's out of like they've realized the necessity of Christianity, but more in like a pragmatic sense, like, okay, we need this thing to function, but not necessarily like this is the foundation of reality itself, not just the West, but like pre-West, you know. And I wonder how church communities will look with these elements imbued in it, you know. Anyways, I guess it's pointless to speculate, but it's just interesting to note that, at least, you know, especially when it comes to Catholicism and Orthodoxy. I don't think Protestantism is having the same influx of the same sorts of people. I think very much it's like a turn to tradition. Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah. Well, I could just add one thing there briefly, and my Reformed minister friend who I mentioned earlier, he's in a conservative portion. And he says there are a lot of Protestants who are kind of tired of the liberalism. So they do look for more conservative forms of Protestantism. So that does happen.
Yeah.
But I think it's just more obvious and more shocking when somebody becomes a Catholic or somebody becomes an Orthodox. It's like it's not, because we all know, I mean, I've got lots of Protestant friends who look around for different churches. So when you go to a more conservative church, it's not seen as a radical shift. So it's almost not really comparable now that I think about it. It's more like I'm just trying a different denomination. Whereas if you become a Catholic, it's like you've completely outside of that whole sphere. Same with Orthodox.
Yeah, you have to be willing to get the reputation that of this person has lost his mind. You're that guy in the family now.
Yeah,
you're that Catholic guy, the guy with the rituals.
Yes, you're the Catholic guy.
Oh my, he's gonna baptize his baby. What an awful thing! Jeez.
But in my experience, like so many people I know, there's no nice way to say this but it's true of Orthodox, and I'm sure it is true of Catholics, and I'm sure it's true of Orthodox. Is like a lot of people are just poorly catechized. So when I speak to Protestants now, my general response 9 out of 10 times is curiosity. It's not like anger. Like they didn't necessarily grow up with Catholics in their street and their parents telling them, don't believe this, they don't know. So they want to know more. That's been my experience.
Yeah. So with that being said, also because there's probably going to be like 5 people listening to this, and they're likely going to be my friends grappling with these exact things that we're talking about. And some of them are Protestants that have been exposed to like more traditional forms of Christianity, I guess more specifically in the Eastern Orthodox Church, through my participation in the church. And some of my friends, like I have a lot of friends who were Christians in like perhaps a non-denominational Protestant type space, and then renouncing Christianity specifically because of that space. I know of more than one instance where people were let down by church leaders. They realized the fallibility of their church leaders. Perhaps there's some scandal or something, and they become like they're associated with that specific church. And there's a lot of funny stuff that happens. The question I want to ask you is if you had to give like three breadcrumbs for someone interested or wanting to understand a bit more about like some of the things we've mentioned. We've mentioned like a specific worldview, a specific lens of viewing the world. Previously, we touched on the whole like irrationality of Christianity, but like a right irrationality. I think these things sound very strange when if you're not in it. I think it's a very strange. I think it's very strange to make sense of it when you're outside of it, especially if you're trying to make sense of it, So I think you can really like work against yourself. But if you had to like give 3 breadcrumbs or pointers, whether it's specific individuals, specific books, or something that you feel like really can be helpful along the way in cultivating a worldview where Christianity becomes inevitable. What do you think worked for you, or what would you recommend?
That's a great question. I'll try and do it justice. I think, first of all, just people are very different. So to one guy, he might be just missing that book that he needs that will just lock everything into place, and that book will be the book that changed his life. But to the next person, if you recommend them a book, they're not even going to think twice. They're not going to read that book. They're not interested. That's not how they foresee themselves changing such a deep opinion. So I think if you're like completely outside of Christianity, like you are let's say you're maybe New Age, I would just tell that person to start praying to Christ instead of praying or asking something else or the universe or whatever, just to like kind of try deliberately talking to Christ and just see what happens, because you'd be surprised. And then for somebody who's like kind of where you and I were, where we're not really satisfied with the whole New Age world, but we still love the mystery and the beauty and the kind of fairy tale nature of those worldviews. But you realize that's not ultimately going to satisfy you. For that person, I would just, if you're philosophically minded, I would say read Chesterton, read Orthodoxy by Chesterton, because that isn't Catholic or Orthodox, even though it's called Orthodoxy. It doesn't mean Eastern Orthodox. It just means Orthodox belief, so right belief. That book will kind of tie up a lot of those knots you have and show you how Christianity is actually more romantic and more fairy tale like than the other beliefs. However, that is a difficult book. Oscar Wilde says a good book is a book that can be read twice, which is witty because you'd have to read it once to know if it's worth reading twice. Yeah. But Orthodoxy is one of those books where you kind of have to read it more than once, and that sounds daunting to people. So I would just say find a guide online, just search like chapter 1 explained, read that guide, and then read the chapter.
You've got a few videos running through Orthodoxy specifically.
Yeah, so if you're really mentally unwell and you want to hear somebody go through every single sentence, line by line of Orthodoxy, I have right now up to chapter 6, literally line by line, comma by comma analysis of every chapter. So if you want to punish yourself, but you got to read, because I read it and then I stop at each sentence. And then if there's a name that gets mentioned, I'll tell you who that guy was, why Chesterton was writing to him, what books he wrote. And so it just gives you like a really detailed picture. I'm still busy with that series though, but it just takes forever. But
it's quite
I didn't want to it's nuts, but I didn't want to plug myself, but yeah, that is an option. Just find any guide you can relative to your time. So those would be maybe my first 2 breadcrumbs. And then my third one, I'm not sure who I would think. I can tell you that the book that helped me a lot was, I'm forgetting the author now, but a book that did help me was More Than a Carpenter, which is that helped me a lot. I'm forgetting the name of the author now. I'm tempted to Google it, but we're in an interview, so I don't want to risk. But More Than a Carpenter. It's a mainstream Christian apologetic book. But if you don't fall into the other 2 categories and you maybe just want some historical treatments of who Christ was, and for me it's a wonderfully tight and wonderfully refined explanation of what happened to the apostles and why were they willing to die and how did the Gospels develop, and it kind of just gives you that a wonderful overview, and it's an amazing place to start if you're more of an intellectual bent. Otherwise, just start praying to Christ as if he's really there and see what happens.
Yeah. Well, thanks for those, Dylan. I appreciate it. And the one you mentioned initially, and you just ended it off with, like praying to Christ as if he's there and seeing what happens. It's so funny, and I've seen it with a lot of people online, and it's funny, like living through that experience as well. But like the moment that I can pinpoint where like things changed, and specifically now, in retrospect, it's been a good few years. This was in 2021, in June specifically. So we're almost there. But I was at a friend's house, and we kind of had this like deep and intense conversation in the evening over the Bible, and he's a Christian and I wasn't. I was trying to tell him about my Zen view and trying to explain Zen. I don't even know why, but I guess it's kind of showing where I was, I'm not even sure if I have an idea what Zen is, you know. But back then I was like, Zen is probably the way. I'm like, oh my God, what's Zen? And it's funny. And he told me this during that night. He was like, well, if you're really into the Zen thing, can I tell you about like the best Zen master I know? And he was like, it's this guy called Christ. And he's like, whatever Zen masters you've read or whatever it is, I can guarantee you they don't have anything on this guy. And that just kind of started a conversation that ended up with him telling me, have you ever prayed to Jesus? And I was like, no. Why would I? You know, why would I pray to something I don't have certainty of? But yeah, that evening, that's exactly what he recommended, and I did. And it's so interesting to see how, like, you hear these things, you know, it's kind of like cliches almost, like take one step towards God and he takes like 10 steps towards you, or that sort of thing. But it's yeah, it's quite frightening once you experience.
Yeah, it's not like I don't know. It's not like some kind of jolly experience usually for people. I mean, if you're in the presence of the true God, I mean, you're in the presence of ultimate perfection and ultimate beauty and ultimate love and ultimate power. And the right response, or the human response to that, is fear and trembling and shaking. And, you know, Paul does say to work out your salvation in trembling. So this idea that, you know, you want God to just appear to you, I don't think God would harm you, of course, but it can be, I don't think we know what we're asking for when we say, show yourself to me. It's like, it can be terrifying, just to go to your point. And it was for me too.
Yeah, I think part of where the terror comes in, and I can't imagine if this is like taken to the fullest extent, but I think in the presence of God, in the presence of truth, it's not that you're just seeing God in all its glory, but you're also seeing yourself for what you really are and who you really are. And I think that's a big part of the terror as well. Like, do you think you have the capacity to really understand like in what state you are? And I feel like I've had like very, very tiny, minute glimpses since becoming a Christian, where it's like actually realizing your state. You know, prior to Christianity, I had this like almost narcissistic view of it all, where I was like, oh, I could feel light and feel flowing and relatively enlightened and all that. And then with Christianity, it's like, so you think you're enlightened, eh? Okay.
I'm a horrible person, actually.
It's like, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me.
Have mercy on me, sort of.
It's like, oh, yeah, and it's and I think also when you're not in that paradigm, that's even frowned upon. You know, when I became Orthodox, one of my good friends was like, the point the part she doesn't like in the Jesus prayer is when it ends with me a sinner. She feels like it's maybe a bit too much. Can't we just say, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me? Do we have to like affirm our sinful state? Doesn't that like bold it or whatever it is? And I'm like, and that's like a big part of the gradual shift. It's like realizing your sinful nature, but there's like a paradox in it, like realizing your lowliness. To the extent you can do that, like the exact opposite will happen to you. Like the saints are those that are just like that take that to the extreme. You know, they're like they know what sinners they are, and they it kind of just tilts in on itself because they take it to the extreme. It's so beautiful, you know. And there are these glimpses in other religions, like Taoism, this idea of the ocean is the greatest because it holds itself the lowest, you know, and everything flows to it because it's the lowest. These like virtues of humility and that sort of thing. Christianity is like the full embodiment of that. It's just yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can give you a beautiful Chesterton line. I think it's from Orthodoxy, where he says that humility is the mother of all giants, because you see beautiful things from the valley, but you see tiny things from the peak. So at the bottom of that valley, when you look up and you see the mountains, you see the how big things and beautiful things are. But when you're right on the top, when you're at the peak, everything is just small and insignificant. And
Wow.
that's humility does that. It's like, but also like humility is, it is a paradox that the greatest sinners are the greatest saints, because this is the magic of Christ. It's like literally the worse a sinner you are, the more potential you have to really convert others. Because if the worst person you know becomes a Christian and his whole life changes, it's like, whoa, if that guy can get his life in order, I mean, there must be something powerful here. So like Christianity never condemns someone eternally. And we need something like that. There needs to be hope for the worst of us, the absolute worst people. There must be something that is not outside of their hope. I mean, there's literally nothing you can do that God can't forgive. I know there's the unforgivable sin, but I mean, that's just denying God is there. So if you deny He's there, then obviously, if you deny the Holy Spirit, then you don't have a means to seek forgiveness. But that's like a technicality. I mean, God is never going to say, no, I'm not going to forgive you. What you did is too bad. So it's like you, and also like you don't really seek God when you're okay, right? It's only when things really hit the fan that you then say, Lord, please help me. And it's like we hate that about ourselves. Hate's maybe a strong word, but we really don't like that about ourselves, that we only go to God when we're weak. But I think God kind of is like, yeah, this is exactly what I knew would happen. And I think if you realize everyone is a sinner, I think it's immensely psychologically healthy for you, because you realize like, okay, well, yeah, people are selfish and people do think for themselves. So when you see someone do something really kind, it has all the more gravity, because you know that person's a sinner. And when you see yourself do something really kind, it hits you hard, because you know you're a sinner. So for me, okay, so I don't want to keep quote mining Chesterton all day, but it's like, it's funny, but it's funny that people dispute the sinner aspect, because that's the one part of Christianity that is obviously true, that we're all sinners.
Yeah. No, completely. Yeah, I guess it's where you are. It's where you position yourself. I think. Can you hear me now?
All good.
Cool.
Go for it.
Yeah. No, I think it's become like pretty evident throughout our conversations that there are like various pockets of realities, not reality with a big R, and like depending on what pocket you find yourself in, you might associate the word sinner with like a certain thing, or you might have a certain idea of how reality works, and you want to like transcend sin by not recognizing, for example, the sin, or perhaps like an approach where like, if I turn my back against it, maybe it'll disappear and I can like move on, that sort of thing. I'm not saying that's necessarily where she was, yeah, she's very. Oh, yeah, I don't know if she's going to see this. This is going to be very interesting if she does. But that girl specifically, she gave me the book Orthodoxy. It's her mom's copy. It's in the back of my bookshelf, actually. And her dad played a big role in my conversion, just in like a little moment, very small moment. The first time I was at their home, her dad told me, he asked me, have you ever read Job? And I was like, no, I haven't read Job. At that point, I hadn't read like any book in the Bible. And as people, they made such a profound impression on me, just in like the way that they were, highly intellectual, very interesting and deep people. And after that encounter, I was like, okay, I'll at least read Job. If this sir tells me to read Job, let me go do it. And I read it, and I read it like 3 times, probably in a week, trying to not necessarily make sense of it, but kind of face the fact that this has always been in the Bible and been part of like the Christian corpus and the Christian tradition, and I hadn't known about it, And it was like, that was also one door that kind of opened up the possibility for me that, perhaps there is a much deeper understanding to this whole Christian thing than I expected, because in the beginning it was like, I always thought it was like super superficial, and the whole rationalization of everything bugged me, and then in Job, you get like God's answer to Job's suffering, and it's like, that's the exact answer I'm actually looking for. Like if Christianity recognizes like this aspect to God and reality, this like mysterious aspect, perhaps I could vibe with it, so yeah, it's very interesting that for some people that's what they want. They want the mystery. That's where they find their solace. I was one of those people, and people always want to like rationalize it, but yeah, I wonder how many people there are like myself, who is just like, what we want is just an acknowledgement of the mystery, and the hope that this mystery is fully embodied in something, and it's in Christianity, But let's talk about the mystery, Anyways.
Yeah, well, I mean, to quote Richard Feynman in a very different way, I would agree with him and say I'd rather have questions that can't be answered than answers that can't be questioned. So I'm happy to have mystery in life. I mean, life is a mystery ultimately. So, but it's not a complete mystery in that there are elements of the mystery that have been revealed to us.
Yeah.
So there are some answers that I can still question, but I can question them all day, but I can't change what's been revealed. So you're still free to question. Yeah. You're still free to say, well, why and this, but the answer is the answer, whether you like it or not. So I think you get the best of both.
Oh, without a doubt, it's that exact thing. Like for me, the revelation of the mystery is exactly what you want, because it's like, here's the revelation, and like that's like, oh, here's the way, right? Here's the way. I am the way. But it's not like it's not here's the way and it's like it's like a list of sentences or something, like here's the way. But it's very literally like how deep does the way go? That's the kicker, So once you see that the way is and Christ is, and once revelation does what it does, brings you into it, then the thing that gets me going is like is participation in the mystery, and it's that sort of language that really made me resonate with orthodoxy specifically, because there was this language of participation in God, and it like just that kind of sentence is far out, It's super far out. Like, okay, to what extent can we participate in God? And not even that, just like that's one of the things, but what if that is the whole point of being? Like to fully participate in God to the extent that you can. Wow, that's such a different story than what most people hear, when they go to church on a Sunday. It's like, yeah.
Yeah, it's not really. I mean, I guess there are taught ways to live a more Christian life, which I guess you could argue is participation in the divine realities. But I mean, like, where are we going to draw the lines, right? So when I'm at the office with my colleagues and I'm trying to be Christ-like, I see myself as trying to participate in the divine realities in a space that doesn't really feel conducive to it. So, you know, I think people participate in different ways, and sometimes they do it without even realizing it. I think Catholicism and Orthodoxy just are very explicit about it. Like they have a language to it. Like you're literally going to eat God's flesh. You're going to eat and drink his blood. Like it's very explicit that you are participating. God is in your body, right? But you can also do it in less, less direct ways. You can do it in ways that are outside of sacraments, although sacraments are the most condensed forms of the process. Is maybe one way to think about it.
Yeah, no, totally. And I'm certain, like, everyone participates to a greater or lesser extent. And I think, like, to the extent that you participate through means of virtuous living, you know, like, I guess there are these ideals that are essentially inseparable from God. I'm no theologian, but I'm certain there are some ideas that, like, that some of these virtues are God in some sense, you know. In Orthodoxy, there's this like essence, energy distinction, and I think that kind of clicks into that, you know. Like, for example, if I look at someone like Jordan Peterson, I don't want to say what people are or to what extent they're participating in the divine realities, or I'm in no position to do that, you know. But it's like, you can't help but get an idea, like, here's a guy who hasn't once said, like, he is a Christian, or there's like no evidence of him like binding himself to a greater body like Catholicism or something like that. But it's very evident that through his way of living and his mode of being, that there's like participation happening in the divine realities. You can see it in like the ripple effects it has, like going out, you know. So it's that sort of thing that it's really interesting. That's all. Yeah.
And God can work through him to lead other people to Christ, as he's done for, like we said earlier, many young men. So I agree. I actually think Peterson will probably be, this is like a prediction I'm making, I guess. I think he's probably going to become Catholic, and I have a reason for why I think that. His wife is a Catholic now.
Yeah.
And when you think about everything we said about how people are not necessarily rational in their initial, like, I don't think I highly doubt when you converted to Orthodoxy or I converted to Catholicism, we printed out 6 PDF documents with every single article from every single denomination, and we wagered up the arguments. And like, it was much, if you're honest with yourself, if I'm honest with myself, it's a much more irrational, it's much more like falling in love, really, than it is like a debate. So I think Peterson will probably, in large part due to his wife, at some point actually go that extra step. But I don't think it will be purely rational. But I don't mean that in a bad way. I don't mean irrational as in untrue, or as in a lie or an illusion. Yeah. I just think he'll kind of end up there. If his wife was Orthodox, by the way, I would have said he would become Orthodox. So it's not like a teen Catholic thing. I think it's just the situation.
Yeah, no, exactly. I've had the same thoughts. I think he's in an interesting position. I think if he falls, I think if he gets to a place where he goes through it, that's more than likely. That's more than likely. Jordan's in,
or he might just keep it private.
More than likely.
I sometimes think,
more than likely.
Yeah. There's some days you like look at him and you think, wow, it must be amazing to be living that life. And then I think, I don't know if I'd want to be living that life. That seems so much, so intense. I mean, the things they've been through. But anyway, not to like go on about that. I just thought I would add that point because you mentioned him. God's energies, maybe I'm using the term incorrectly, but God's presence can affect people even through someone who's not trying to propound a specific view of Christ.
Yeah. No, totally. Yeah. Okay, that's good. I think we can almost call it there. I'm very satisfied with all the things we've touched. I wouldn't want to necessarily, yeah, just drag it out unnecessarily. I'm very happy with all these things we touched on. Thanks, Dylan. Yeah, this idea. Sorry, just the last little tangent, but
No, it's fine. Go for it.
I've been like figure out the language of talking about it, because saying irrational has this context of it's like a dumb thing to do. Why would you do irrational things? It's like rationality is virtuous, and so irrationality is like why would you engage in irrational behavior or base your life on irrational decisions? And for sake of differentiation, I've been talking about like non-rational. I don't know if you can use non in that way, but when I'm talking to people, I try and make that differentiation. I'm like, irrational has all these connotations, but it seems like what we're talking about is this. I find it helps to use the term non-rational. Yeah.
I think that's a good idea, and I'm going to start saying non-rational, because let me give you a counter example. If I have to assess someone or test someone to see if they're competent and they fail, I'm not going to say you are incompetent. I'm going to say you're not yet competent. Yeah. And there's a huge difference, because the word incompetent, basically the connotation is that you're an idiot. I mean, so you'd rather say not yet competent. In exactly the same way, I think you'd rather say non-rational than irrational, because there's a connotative meaning that you just can't ignore. So thank you for that. Yeah, you've helped me today as well. A lot of things you've said, you've helped clear up a lot of the way I think about these things through the conversation. So also just thanks for that specifically, but also more broadly.
Why, thank you. It's such a nice opportunity to kind of work through some of these things. Hear a little back and forth. I really appreciated it a lot, And Jordan Peterson says it the whole time, forwards and upwards, or onwards and upwards. That's it. Voorwaarts en opwaarts is die term. Voorwaarts en opwaarts. Yeah. Thanks, Dylan.
Big pleasure. For my channel, one of my goals is just to propagate Chesterton, and I have a lot of people emailing me about him and asking me questions and for recommendations and stuff. But I always say, like, his poetry is, well, it will literally have you reading poetry for the first time if you've never read poetry. Yeah. It's so beautiful. I mean, the poem I told you about was The Convert, and at the end I told you that line about, but none of this matters to me because my name is Lazarus. The look on your face is the look on everyone's face. It's like, wow, this is like really, really good. Yeah. Can I share with you just 2 quick tidbits that I think you'll find helpful?
Please do.
Okay, so we'll do this again when we have our conversation in the undetermined future. But one is, his shortest poem is my favorite. It's actually the one that Alan Watts quotes in one of his talks, but it's called The Skeleton. And you basically just imagine a skeleton in a garden, right? And there's lots of little bugs buzzing around, and there's life in the garden, but there's a skull lying in the grass, and the skull is actually the one saying the poem to you. It's only 8 lines, and the poem is just, here among, do you know this one? Okay. So, here among the flowers I lie, laughing everlastingly. No, I may not tell the best. Surely, friends, I might have guessed that death was only the good king's jest. It was hid so carefully. No, I may not tell the best. Surely, friends, I might have guessed. Death was just the good king's jest, just the good king's joke. It was hidden so carefully. This idea that the skeleton is actually talking from the other side and telling you, like, death is actually just God's joke. And is beautiful imagery because the skeleton is more alive than the garden. So the saints in heaven are more alive than us here on earth, right? Because we're stuck in sin. Okay, that's one point. And then another one is my favorite, because Chesterton, before he became a Catholic, he already loved the Virgin Mary. He had a devotion. He used to pray a rosary before he became Catholic. He loved the Theotokos. And he has this poem where he talks about her colors. He talks about the colors of creation. And then he ties it back to Mary. So he talks about white, and then he talks about the white of the Alps and the white of the oceans, and then he brings that to Mary. And then eventually he gets to the color blue, right? I'm going to get super hyped when I tell you this because it always blows me away. But he says, when God was painting the skies, he decided to make all the skies blue, because if it was good enough for her, then it was good enough for eternity.
Yeah.
That just is like, if it was good enough for her, it's good enough for eternity. Like just the that level of just love. I just think that's so brilliant. And I mean, Chesterton's just full of stuff like that, man. Like you got to take a deep dive someday.
It's really.
But anyway,
it's rich. It's like it's the stuff, you know. It's like the real stuff. The way it makes you perceive things, like the way it makes me perceive, like that one you also mentioned with Christ reaching out to his mother's face, and it's like, oh, he captures a lot, you know. He captures like. Well, it's rich. That's the whole point. It's rich. It's like it stretches, and it touches like such like different aspects. It's like the one thing, but it's like, oh, like while hearing it, your mind kind of it catches like these different aspects of reality in a moment. It's very interesting, just even hearing it being recited by you.
Yeah, and it's like when you watch a good movie and you go, wow, that was really good. Like that actually changed something in me. That's what I get with Chesterton all the time. It's like he's literally shifting the way you see things as you encounter the ideas, and the way he says them, he just pulls your mind apart. Like in Orthodoxy, when he talks about how God is mystery like the sun. You can't see it directly, but the sun gives meaning to everything. It gives light to everything. But reason is like the moon, because it's crisp and clear, and you have a reason for everything. So the madman is not the man who has lost everything. It's sort of the madman is the man who's lost everything except his reason. So it's not that he lost his reason. All he has left is his reason. All he has left is that crisp moon. And then he says, and that's why the moon is the mother of all crazy people. And for many years, people thought the moon drove people crazy. And then he says, and that's why the moon has given her name to every single lunatic. And you realize that the word lunatic root is lunar. And it's like all these connections. Like, oh my gosh, I've got to read more of this guy. I'm amped now to read more. Sorry. No, sorry, man. I'll get so amped about this.
No, it's amazing. And it's like, it's again, it shows this like flipped nature of things, that the most rational man, the man who only has rationality left, that is the lunatic. It's one of those things where if you just hear it once, you have to be like, wait, what? But then you sit with it and you see how it fits into this how it makes sense, and you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. The sun and the moon thing, wow, really good. Thank you.
Anyway,
I appreciate it.
Thanks, Stefan. Yeah, it was lovely talking to you, man. I had a real joy. I'm sure the podcast will just